Boston as a fiscal military hub. Debt, death, and deals. I'm sure you all know what Boston is. It's the capital city of the state of Massachusetts on the eastern coast of the United States. It's also the center of political and economic power for the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the 18th century. More relevantly, let's define the key term of fiscal military hub. A fiscal military hub is a city characterized by the clustering of expertise and resources in one location. Regions where state, semi-state, and non-state actors come together to move war-making resources. This comes from Peter Wilson's and Marion Clark's landmark 2020 paper, The Business of War Untangled. Fiscal military hubs are part of a larger historian conversation of the early modern period, examining what's known as the military revolution, how states grow and change with the growth of armies and the production of munitions and gunpowder weapons. All of these come together to help us understand the early modern period. But what makes fiscal military hubs unique is that they shift the conversation away from state-on-state interactions, France versus Austria, Austria versus England, and moves them towards non-state and state interactions, how businesses interact with governments, who purchases arms, who moves those arms. Why is this research important, and why does my research matter? Firstly, fiscal military hubs are extremely new. That prior mentioned paper was published in December of 2020. It is cutting edge in terms of historical research, with only a few papers published on the topic and more being actively published and researched right now. But because of this relative newness, especially in the early modern period, it is Eurocentric. Currently, the research focuses on London, Amsterdam, Brussels, Genoa, European cities that early modern historians are familiar with. My research took in an entirely new direction. I went to the Massachusetts State Archives in Boston and examined more than 1,800 pages in archival primary source documents. I looked at legislatures, receipts, charters, journals, and ledgers, all to examine how Boston was a fiscal military hub. How did the businesses interact with the politics of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War from 1756 to 1763. Here are some example documents, by the way. There are many, many variations in handwriting that were difficult to read. There are 4 points of interest that we'll be looking at to examine Boston as a fiscal military hub. We'll be examining Boston as a place of business and politics, Boston as a center of trade, Boston as a nexus of credit and financing, and finally, how all of these come together in the case study of Nathaniel Wheelwright. First, fiscal military hubs matter because they're regions where people communicate. Letters have to be sent somewhere. Businessmen have to shake hands, make appeals to colonial legislatures. Fiscal military hubs are key locations where that can happen. We see the rise of important and prominent men inside of Boston during the 7 Years' War. There is Commissary General John Wheelwright, who was responsible for moving thousands of pounds, the currency and weight, of materials to the front lines in order to make sure that the soldiers are fed. We also see, more relevantly, Royal Governor William Shirley, who was responsible for using exclusive shipping contracts to curry favor with the local political merchant elite. These exclusive shipping contracts also provided a stable form of supplies as they moved across the Atlantic. In terms of moving things beyond material, we also see the moving of men. Brigadier Timothy Ruggles was appointed as a private military contractor on behalf of the Massachusetts Bay government to hire and move men and materials. Using his own personal capital, he was able to efficiently manage thousands of men by the end of the 7 Years' War. Finally, we see examples of both shipping companies and Agent William Bullen. We see the Livingston and Moore shipping companies, a private business forming a relationship with Governor William Shirley. But these relationships would also have political backlashes. The Livingston and Moore shipping company were seen as corrupt when they engaged with William Shirley, and due to influence by the New York governor, eventually they'd be ousted and replaced with the equally exclusive Delancey merchant family. William Bullen, as a final note, was the agent that worked for Massachusetts Bay Colony in London. He was responsible for coordinating and buying supplies across the ocean and making sure that they were shipped directly to Boston for the Massachusetts Colonial Army. We also examined Boston as a center of trade. Boston was a port city. It was able to draw in troops and materials from all over the Atlantic into one location to be coordinated for the war effort. We see that Boston, most importantly for the war, was able to move arms. It moved thousands of muskets, pistols, ordnance, gunpowder, and barrels all to one location in order to make sure that troops had the guns they needed to kill the French. We also see that those guns were put into the hands of men. Boston drew in men all over from the Massachusetts colony to one location so that they could be armed and properly equipped. We also see other colonies use Boston as a staging station. When colonies moved their troops northward in order to invade Canada in 1760, Boston was identified as a key site in the Boston Town City Commission records for where these troops were coordinated. Beyond guns, we also see various materials and sundries. Meat, grain, alcohol, winter coats, all of these and more were necessary to arm the troops and were bought and sold and managed through Boston. These materials were moved through shipping companies. While the earlier mentioned shipping companies were responsible for moving goods across the Atlantic, internally, Boston was also the site of where dozens of independent mailing contractors were responsible for moving goods between forts and garrisons, and also to the front lines. In this way, it wasn't the government managing a large bureaucratic network, it was taking advantage of the businessmen of the region. The final point of looking at Boston's fiscal military hub in terms of broad ideas is financing and credit. Wars are extremely expensive. Money is needed now to kill the French later. As a result, we see that there are many forms of borrowing in the long and the short term that were responsible for helping Boston and Massachusetts as a whole prosecute the war. Boston was the site of where the British Parliament sent more than £120,000 worth of cash in order to pay for soldiers and goods. Boston was also the site of direct taxation. The Massachusetts government would forcefully appropriate loans from its citizens to be paid at a later date. This amusingly resulted in loans paying for loans paying for loans, an inveritable Ponzi scheme that almost crashed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In addition to this, we see, due to British colonial policy, colonies were not allowed to make their own banks or mint their own coins. That means that governments could use governmental bonds as a form of stable investment asset to get cash now and to help finance years later. Boston was also a city personally vested interest inside the credit and loan system, as Boston was the only city during the 7 Years' War to personally take out a loan inside the Massachusetts colony. It used it to help keep its economy afloat, as well as to make sure it could fund public works ventures. Finally, Boston was a site of currency exchange. There are more than 8 currencies that were exchanged inside the region of Boston because specie hard coinage was extremely hard to come by. Hard coinage is responsible for backing colonial paper currency, giving it confidence. And hard coinage was also the only form of currency that soldiers and Atlantic merchants would accept, because as soon as you moved the paper currency across the ocean, it was functionally worthless. As a result, we see the Spanish silver dollars, the Portuguese moedas and johannes, as well as the British pounds, shillings, and penny farthings, all as examples of hard coinage mixed with colonial paper currency that were being exchanged inside of Boston. Through these 3 overbroad concepts, we see that Boston was a site of making deals, of moving the goods that the deals were made, and of purchasing those goods and materials with credit and finance. All 3 of these elements come together in the study of Nathaniel Wheelwright. Nathaniel Wheelwright was a wealthy merchantman and the son of the previously mentioned John Wheelwright. Due to connections with the Bostonian government in the form of Royal Governor William Shirley, as well as his father who died in 1760, he was able to gain market confidence in the region. Merchants were able to trust him due to his political connections. As a result, he established an unofficial bank in the region. People would trust him with his money, and he distributed promissory notes that were essentially like paper checks. However, in 1765, 2 years after the end of the war, he would flee, becoming bankrupt and rendering all those paper currency functionally worthless. The Boston economy crashed overnight, and he died 3 months later, never prosecuted for his crimes. Through Nathaniel Wheelwright, we see the 3 elements that made Boston a fiscal military hub. We see the credit and financing that was needed by merchants now due to a lack of hard coins. We see the center of trade, the hundreds of merchants in the region being necessary to fund his banking ventures. And we see that his political connections gave him market confidence with the local economy. Conclusion? Yes, Boston was in fact a fiscal military hub. And North America is worth researching when considering the ideas of how the early modern period interacted with fiscal military systems. But why does this matter for the modern day? 250 years later, why does one city and one war matter? Well, there are multiple reasons for this. 1, examining fiscal military hubs reorients military warfare and military history around examining how the economics interacts with warfare beyond just logistical supply chains in an overbroad state sense. We can look at how specific cities can be key for prosecuting a war effort, how specific businesses in a military-industrial complex can help a war function. In the modern day, we can see this example in Ukraine and Russia, how key cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, while strategically important for urban warfare, are also important because they have the infrastructure and the people with the expertise inside those cities to manage and purchase armaments and materials. Fiscal military hubs also help us consider, how does debt interact with warfare? Borrowing money is something that the American government is extremely familiar with to prosecute a war. Debt has the potential risk to crash an economy, as the Massachusetts Bay Colony almost did in 1766. But debt also has the ability for a government to win a war, as evidenced by the fact that Britain did manage to win the 7 Years' War. Finally, we can also see that fiscal military hubs are vital in understanding how the American Revolution functioned. It is a key point in our American history that helped us evolve into the nation we are today. 13 years after the 7 Years' War, many of the same problems that are cited by colonists as causing the revolution to happen can be seen starting in the 7 Years' War, or at least being greatly exaggerated. Oppressive taxation colonies by the British, of the more than 300,000 pounds that ended up flowing through Boston for the war, would end up causing the colonists to revolt. No taxation without representation. Favoritism between the businessmen and the politicians was seen as a form of corruption by the local citizens, something that ought to be fought against, entrenched power. We also see notable examples like Samuel Adams Sr. and Samuel Adams Jr. participating in the taxation and trade system, or Loyalist Brigadier Timothy Ruggles, who would eventually be exiled to Canada after losing the war. Through fiscal military hubs, we can see that the examination of how non-state actors and state actors interact is important in not only understanding warfare, but American history. Any questions?